Good evening, Dezombified friends. We present to you My Grandfather's Cabin, written by Mythology Loves Horror, a really scary story powered by Dezombified.
The hunting cabin was just as I remembered it. It was tiny, hardly bigger than a tool shed, and after a year of neglect, dust now coated every surface. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years. Not since the last time I went hunting with my grandfather Sebastian. I had been so terrified by the creature we saw in the woods that I hadn't wanted to return. And my parents just assumed I was too bored to want to spend 2 weeks with a boring old man. Gramps still came to visit us, but thankfully, we never went there. When Gramps passed away a year ago, he left the cabin and the 30 acres surrounding it to his only remaining grandchildren. At 20 years old, I had never expected to set foot on the rural mountainside again, much less inherit it. But a bad breakup had left me the decision of moving into the cabin or into my parents' basement. The choice had almost been hard to make. The local newspaper, the Village Times, had claimed that Gramps died of a bear attack while out chopping firewood behind his cabin. I didn't buy that story though. And even as I pulled my beat-up old Ford into the unpaved driveway, I had my hand on my gun. The old Remington might not do much to the creature roaming those woods, but it made me feel better. I hadn't seen the thing in a decade, but if it was still around, then I would be prepared this time. Several hours later, I was unpacked, and the cabin was decently clean. All of the utilities were hooked up, and the refrigerator was stocked. I had taken the week off of work so that I could adjust to my new lifestyle, and I was planning on just relaxing for the next few days. My first night and day passed uneventfully, but by the second night, things were getting a little weird. I had spent enough time in the country as a child to be familiar with creatures like raccoons, skunks, bears, and other mammals, but the freshly made claw marks on the side of the cabin weren't anything I recognized. I woke up on my third morning to the gouges, and I was pretty unnerved. They were too large to belong to any small critters, too high up to be from coyotes, and too wide to be from a mountain lion or a bear. In this neck of the woods, that ruled out everything logical. As I studied the claw marks, I wonder, how could I have slept through them being made? They definitely hadn't been there when I first arrived, and the fresh marks stood out in a bright contrast to the weathered wood of the cabin walls. I supposed a human could have made them with a knife, but I didn't have neighbors for miles. Who could be skulking around out there just to prank me? It didn't make any sense. It crossed my mind that my ex might have done it just to freak me out. But Sandra lived almost 50 miles away and didn't have the address for the cabin in the first place. I don't use social media enough to bother listing my new address, and we didn't have friends in common or anything anyway. I eventually shrugged to myself, deciding to let it go. I knew that worrying about it wouldn't help, but that afternoon I found myself driving the 10 miles into town and buying some motion-activated floodlights and a motion-sensing camera. 2 more nights passed, and each morning I woke up to the claw marks getting closer and closer to the cabin door. As much as I wanted to believe that it was just a stupid prank, I had to admit to myself that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that idea. The floodlights would turn on and the camera would snap, but all I ever saw in the photos was an empty yard. I had even tried to set up a video on my phone, but all it managed to capture was a vague blur of movement at the edge of the screen. I had had enough. On the 5th night, I went outside, gun in hand, and settled comfortably on the porch steps. There was no noise, no sound to indicate that the unusual nocturnal critters were up and about. I shut all of the lights off and waited for the creature that I knew would come. Hours passed, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, I snapped myself out of a doze. I could hear something moving quietly out by the edge of the woods, where a figure was skulking around, its features hidden in shadows. As the creature drew closer, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. It was Sebastian, my supposedly dead grandpa. The unclothed figure paused in mid-step, its head slowly turning to face me after hearing me gasp in shock. Gramps looked sickly, with skin pale and visible ribs. He was bald now, his once Santa-like beard and hair gone. Gramps? I could hear the quiver in my voice, and my hands were shaking from terror. The gun had fallen to my lap, nearly forgotten in the intensity of seeing my presumably dead grandfather. I had been so convinced that the antlered creature I saw years ago had killed Sebastian that I had never once considered that my grandfather might still be alive. Gramps, what are you doing here? Come home. Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I didn't care what my grandfather had been doing or why he was out there. All I cared about was that he was alive. I just wanted to hug him again.
Run, stupid boy! It's coming!
Sebastian's voice barely sounded human. His warning came out as an almost reptilian hiss, and before I could respond, Gramps was bounding into the woods on all fours. He was gone in the blink of an eye, the bushes hardly swaying where he had passed through. The woods remained as eerily silent as they had been, even though my grandfather's retreat should have made a large amount of noise. Not a second later, a low growl came from behind me, the sound reverberating off the cabin walls. A massive creature, the one from my memory, approached from around the side of the cabin. Within seconds it became clear to me that it wasn't a human or an animal, unless someone was wearing an amazing costume. The creature was every bit as surreal as I remembered it. Long, pale limbs sprouted from an emaciated torso, and the ivory deer skull shined, and while little moonlight managed to bleed out through the clouds, it was wearing ragged old buckskin leggings and had beads around its neck. I couldn't see any eyes, but I knew without a doubt that it was staring directly at me. I think it was a wendigo or a skinwalker, though the difference between the two types of monsters was always a bit beyond me. Before I could take in any more detail, the thing began to laugh, a guttural sound that echoed in my head hauntingly. It was laughing so hard that it nearly doubled over, and I realized that its limbs were able to wrap around its body twice. I raised the gun and fired several shots at it point blank, the bullets lodging firmly into the creature's neck and torso. The being looked down at its new piercings, and it began to dig out the bullets at an unhurried pace. It dropped them onto the ground like a child plucking flower petals, and it seemed to sigh in irritation as it dug the last one out.
Why must humans always do this?
It spoke in such perfect English that I was dumbfounded. What was going on? What did the creature want? Had Gramps known about this horrendous-looking thing? My head began to ache with the strain of trying to figure it out, so I turned my attention back to the monster. The bullets clearly hadn't done more than annoy it, and I half expected it to lunge for me.
No forthcoming apology, human?
It was still staring at me, its foot tapping impatiently as it waited. It shouldn't sound so human. I tried to say something, but my voice came out as more of a strangled squeak than my usual baritone. Well, I suppose that shall do. Now get along inside before that evil little denizen comes looping back. I just stood there. I tried to will my feet to move, but I was so scared that I felt my bladder give out instead. A warm pee ran down the side of my leg, and for just a second, my mortification overruled my terror. Oh, really now? Urination, truly? Have you not conquered your base instinct beyond its primitive farce? It's not all about you, you know. Sebastian was a dear friend of mine, and one would think you would offer condolences instead of shooting me like a barbarian. You're a monster! Ah, of course, your simple little mind should be able to comprehend this more familiar form a bit better. Suddenly the horrifying creature was gone, and in its place stood Sebastian's best friend, Rufus. Rufus had been around as long as I could remember, and had always been a kind old man. He supposedly lived on the other side of the mountain, even though I had never actually seen any houses over there when Gramps and I would hunt. Rufus just always sort of appeared out of nowhere, usually startling us so badly that we had almost shot him a few times.
There, boy. This better for you?
I merely nodded, still not trusting my voice. This was just a nightmare. I fruitlessly tried to convince myself that I must have dozed off on the porch, and that I could probably wake myself up if I tried hard enough. I began pinching my exposed skin mercilessly, a bruise forming after a few rough grabs. Rufus watched me, his head cocked to the side questioningly.
What in tarnation are you doing, whippersnapper?
I've got to wake myself up.
Sorry to break it to you, kid, but this ain't no dream. Now get your hide on inside for that thing that looks like your grandpappy coming back and guts ya. The scratch marks on trees and cabins are its claiming territory, but if it gets close enough to you to mark your face, your dinner.
I was shaking so hard from fear that I could barely move my limbs, but I managed to navigate the steps. I'm not entirely sure why I obeyed the creature, but seeing it morph into a familiar face was easier to deal with than the knowledge that it was probably about to eviscerate me with every step. I needed some semblance of normalcy, so I went about my usual pre-bed routine. I mindlessly made sure all the doors and windows were locked. Then I took a hot shower to help relax and clean myself up. I crawled into bed after, my adrenaline finally calming down. Now I was just in pure shock, and I noticed that I was repetitively reassuring myself that I would wake up and everything would be normal. Too bad, even getting this written down hasn't managed to convince me that things are okay. Rufus said there were scratches on the trees outside too, so in the next few days I'm going into the woods to find out just how far they extend. I have more questions than answers, but maybe I can at least find out more about Rufus, like if he really does have a cabin nearby. I need to learn about what I'm dealing with, and I can't do that if I just keep cowering in my grandpa's cabin. I'm bringing my gun and buying a few more in town before I go in there, and I'll write down anything I discover about this crazy mess.
Thank you for listening to My Grandfather's Cabin, written by Mythology Loves Horror. She's a fantastic talent with stories across YouTube. Have a good night, and as always, watch your six.